YouTube.
Exactly. The kings of Israel. This, my friends, is going to be our last Bible study class on the kings of Israel. We did it. We persevered. Rick and Tom online have you win all the awards for sticking with it. And I hope that over it, you've learned something new about a new king that you haven't thought about or considered. And we could spend 2 semesters or a lifetime just reading the book of Kings and putting it back together. And if I really disliked you, I would start going through the book of Chronicles next.
Same story told it from a different viewpoint.
It's the same story, but in some ways more heavily edited. And if you notice in the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it follows mostly the kings of Judah and excludes the northern kingdom. So there's something about that too. We're talking about King Josiah last week, and one of the big reforms of King Josiah. Yeah, one of the reforms, I told you we weren't going to have it because no one was here, but then 4 or 5 people showed up after you left, and I felt bad, Judy. But I do have it recorded, and so if you'd like, I can send it to you next week, or I can send it to you like a YouTube video. But we talking about King Josiah, and one of the things he did is he was really good about removing all the shrines, the local shrines from around the area. And one of those shrines was to this person, Moloch. Moloch is a general word. It means to sacrifice. It's this verb to sacrifice. And so there's some debate among archaeologists. Is that the proper name of this god, Moloch the god? Or is that just that they offer Moloch sacrifices? But we see, Moloch referred to in other places in scripture and pop culture. We're talking about John Milton in Paradise Lost. He said, "First Moloch, horrid king besmeared with blood of human sacrifice, parents' tears." Man, what a line. Almost worth trying to read and comprehend John Milton. But you read something like Paradise Lost, and you have to read it with another book going through all the annotations and explaining every metaphor. But what it is he's referring to this Old Testament false idol that's kind of present, where people were supposedly offering human sacrifice and child sacrifice. Lou, you went to Israel.
Yeah, a long time ago.
If I see some kids, this might be Sarah coming in. If you drive around one side of the old city, you look to your side. On one side with all the famous cemetery plots, headstones, and you come around the corner, you're coming around the right hand side, and it drops off into this valley, and it's called the Valley of Gehenna. And this believed that this is where they would offer sacrifice to Moloch, the king, the god king of sacrifice, human sacrifice. Hi, Sarah. And so Gehenna isn't this kind of ethereal place. It's this very real place just outside the city walls. It's just outside. And in the time of Jesus, it would have been the place they're using it at the time as a garbage dump. And I don't know, you go to Haiti or someplace, you go someplace where there's not good refuse, and the smell of burning garbage is so overwhelming and disgusting. And for a lot of sanitary reasons, of course, that's why you take it outside the city and you burn it so you don't have to smell it inside the city. But there's this place called Gehenna, Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. I know it's all very confusing, but the Valley of Hinnom, Gehinnom, which we translate as Gehenna, is this place that was associated with child sacrifice, a place of just evilness, and a place of garbage and refuse and burning. And so this makes sense when Jesus refers to Gehenna over and over. Jesus says, "You fool shall be guilty enough." Anyone who says "you fool" shall be guilty enough to go into Gehenna. It's better for you that one of your body parts should perish than for your whole body be thrown into Gehenna. Or to the Pharisees, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of Gehenna?" The translation is a tough thing. When they put it into Greek, they would translate it to Hades, but Hades has this implication. And then we start to have this devolution of what is hell. And then you have, Dante's Inferno and all this imagery of hell and of these demons and these circles of hell and eternal lakes of fire. But to Jesus, he's referring to a very real place, this place just outside Jerusalem, this place that people would have been familiar. And I think it's also helpful to understand the Hebrew, the Israelite understanding of heaven, right? This is why like the book of Job is so interesting, that heaven isn't some ethereal place full of angels and swirling deities and endless delight. Heaven was here on earth. God loves you. You're a righteous person, so God will give you land, and God will give you long life, and God will give you health, and God will give you children. There's like 4 big things. This is how God rewards you, and it's tangible now. And so Job is like really pissed off because he's like, I've done everything to be righteous. I've lived this perfect lifestyle. And yet God is punishing me. God is taking away my health and my children and my wealth. And I don't know what I've done to deserve this. So it's like really interesting theologically. It's probably today in the Old Testament reading starts with probably one of the greatest lines in all of Scripture. Good morning, Sarah. Where God finally confronts Job. And it was hard not to preach on this line, but it's one of the greatest lines of all time, where God comes to Job and says, gird up your loins like a man and answer me this. It's like, of all the things I hear on my judgment day, that's the last thing I want to hear. It's like, gird up your loins. Oh shit, here it goes. Like, it's so powerful and intense. And then God says, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Were you there when I called the morning star into existence? And all of a sudden Job's like, oh shit. Like, no.
It's so funny that today we say, put on your big girl panties.
Put on your big girl panties. That's it. But gird up your loins. It's about to get real. And so we have this weird image now of heaven and hell, and it's been distorted over 2,000 years, and it's been separated by language and by the evolution of our language and by art and culture. And so now to this point where I think people have these really weird caricatures of heaven and hell, where you're driving down 65 and like, go to church or the devil will get you, like this pitchfork. It's like this distortion of things. Oh my gosh. Oh no, the animals have arrived. I love it. So all I have to say, most things in the Bible are rooted in something real. And most of theology that we expound early on through Scripture is very rooted in something tangible and something functional. And so especially with hell, Jesus isn't saying something like, God's casting you out forever, but like this is what it's like to be cut off from community. This is what it's like when you sin against your neighbor, when you wound somebody, not just with physically murdering somebody, but hatred in your heart. It's better for you to be outside the city walls in this refuge, sitting in the smelly gunk, than to like just hold on to that anger, if that makes sense. Ben Paul, how's it going?
Are you talking about Tennessee?
Yeah, we're talking about Tennessee. We're talking about the Gehenna that was the Tennessee football field yesterday. So back to Josiah, my favorite king. He removed from the entrance the temple of the Lord, the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. That what we see is through the corruption of these generations of kings, it's not just bringing foreign deities into Israel. It's not just building altars around Israel. It's intruding into the temple itself. The temple that's supposed to be this great shrine to God Almighty has become so corrupted that it's now this pantheon of the gods. One of the things in the Jewish revolts, you're familiar with world history, in the Jewish revolts, between the time of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem in 65 AD, there are 3 major revolts, mostly led by the Zealots. The Zealots, we're all in, let's attack Rome, let's kick Rome out. And one of the things that made them the most upset is they had put some Roman gods in the temple, on the Temple Mount. They said, you have corrupted the very nature of our temple. You have, like, in essence, defiled what it means to be Jewish. They had 3 big revolts, and after the 3rd revolt, they just said, screw this, and they destroyed it all. Rome said, we're done with you. Let's lay waste to all of Jerusalem. And they renamed it. They said, there's no longer Israel. They called it Palestina, Syria. It kind of intermixing all of the Palestinian area, all the Israeli area, all the way through Lebanon into Syria. And they said, worst of all, this is one ethnic group. You are all just a people. To which the Jews were horrified, like, oh, hell no, we're not. But that was the destruction of Israel. And we don't get that back until the early 1900s. Consideration around this. So Josiah is like cleaning out the temple. The temple that's being corrupted. It's become this pantheon of gods, of local gods. He pulls down the altars of the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz, and the altars Manasseh had built. He removed them and smashed them to pieces and threw the rubble into the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley, if you remember, is, we should all just go to Israel. We should go and check it out. The Kidron Valley is like this little valley that you're looking when you're at the Mount of Olives. And when you go down to Gethsemane on the side of the Mount of Olives, where Jesus prays his last prayer, he's looking over this valley. In the valley, I use the term loosely. Y'all familiar with Lakeshore and where Brookwood Village Mall is built? That's like Kidron Valley, right? Brookwood, like you see the creek right there that separates Brookwood on one side and Lakeshore Drive on the other. That's the Kidron Valley. You see a hillside on each side, and like where Brookwood would be, let's say, the way it's set up, Brookwood would be the Mount of Olives. And you go over that to Vestavia. If you go up over that, you go to the Dead Sea in the Continental Divide. On the other side where my house is, where the YMCA is, that's where the temple is. So if you imagine Lakeshore, Brookwood, and the YMCA, if you're at Brookwood, you can see the YMCA, or just about. Theoretically, you can see it. Maybe it's like the Courtyard Marriott right there. And so you can see them like right there. They're right beside each other. And that's where the blood from the sacrifice would flow through the Kidron Valley. So it's the place where they carved it, and they carved these rivulets through the temple, because if you're going to sacrifice 100,000 animals at Passover, it's going to be a lot of blood, and it's going out of that through the Kidron Valley, and it's going to dump into the Gehenna, right? And where the final refuse will be. What they would do in the temple, because the temple just get disgusting, because you have 100,000 bodies, like at an Alabama game, right? And you have 100,000 human beings. It's a lot of mud and gunk, and they're bringing animals, and it's over several days of holiday. So animals are pooping everywhere, and then you're killing things and blood everywhere. So what they would do is they would close it down, they'd lock it down, and they'd flood it up to a couple feet. They'd flood the whole Temple Mount, let the doors go, and it'd wash out and through the Kidron Valley and wipe everything away. It's a good way to do it, right? It's clever. And so one way they just clean it all. So you see Josiah, he's destroying these altars, throwing it down into the Kidron Valley where blood is being poured over it, where it's all being defiled. He desecrated the high places, the ones Solomon, king of Israel, had built. Because Solomon, remember, at the end of his life, is marrying these foreign women who are bringing these foreign gods. Josiah smashed sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the site with human bones. It gets real when you start pulling out human bones. I don't know, there's a church in Rome called the Church of Bones. And we had gone. What happened was, it used to be that in this courtyard of where there's this little monastery, they would bury all the bones of the monks who died. They buried the people, and the people became bones. Well, Rome passed a law at one point, like the 1400s, say you can no longer bury people or have people buried within the confines of Rome itself. And the monks thought, well, we're not going to just like desecrate and get rid of these bones. They're precious to us. So there was like a provision in the law. There's some lawyer. It's like, I've got an idea. Lawyers are always looking for a way, right? So some lawyers like, let's do this. What if we made a chandelier out of skulls? And they called it the Church of Bones because they dug up all the bones and they decorated every inch with the human remains. And so they have altars made out of bones, chandeliers, the walls have bones everywhere. So Katie and I were there to see it. We knew what, it's near the Trevi Fountain, like a really big place, and this kind of a lesser known. So we were excited. It had been closed down for lunch. We're waiting at the gates for it to be open to go in and tour. And there was a teacher, young teacher, and it looked like he had a school of like 10 middle school students with him. And he's saying, and it's mostly girls, he's saying, I'm not going to tell you what we're going to see inside, but it's a real surprise. And Katie and I were just looking at each other like, this has not been well planned. And the first thing that happened is like girls started like screaming and passing out, like all kinds of histrionic. He should have given some heads up, but it's quite dramatic. But that's what Josiah does. Josiah pulls out all the bones because it's physically desecrating the space. This is, in fact, what the Muslims have done to the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate is the gate coming into Jerusalem that Jesus walks in triumphantly on Palm Sunday. Jesus comes in because it's part of the prophecy is that the Messiah will come through the Golden Gate into the temple. When Islam came and took control of the Temple Mount sometime, probably 600 years ago, 700 years ago. One of the things they did was they closed the gate, locked it, sealed it, bricked it up, and then they buried a bunch of Islamic folks, Muslim folks, right in front of the gate, because bones desecrate the space. You can't walk across a graveyard. That would make you ritually unclean. So a Messiah can't ride in. Now it's confusing because on the other side, you're standing in this graveyard looking at the Golden Gate, right? That's sealed. On the other side is the Mount of Olives with all the Jewish graves, but that's totally different. The Messiah wasn't going to walk through those graves. The Messiah was those graves are waiting to be reopened. When the Messiah comes, those people like bust through their graves, and kind of this mass horror movie of like skeletons climbing, it's like Michael Jackson's Thriller. Skeletons will be climbing out of those graves to come back and follow the Messiah through the Golden Gate. They're put there intentionally to see the Messiah come in. But whoever it is in Islam has desecrated the Golden Gate, just like Josiah is doing now. Josiah looks around and he saw the tombs that there on the hillside. He had the bones removed and burned on the altar in accordance with the word of the Lord. Very hardcore. And last week we were talking about this, Rick. And then Josiah does something that hasn't been done for generations. As a matter of fact, so far in the past that we don't even know, there's no history of it being done. We're not even sure the last time this happened. And Josiah is so shocked that he's devastated. They celebrate the Passover. It's the first time, maybe in generations, maybe in 100 years, maybe in several hundred years, but they celebrate the Passover. And in this way, it's a renewing of this relationship with God. It's saying, yes, we are God's people once again. It says, neither in the days of the judges who led Israel, nor the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had any such Passover been observed. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem. Not only was this a party, it was the party to end all parties. It was the Passover of all Passovers. Has anybody ever taken part in a Passover supper?
Sure.
Yeah, it's like matzah for everybody. Come on. And so it was this very humble and very, profound celebration of turning back to God. And then, of course, my favorite line in the whole Bible, and neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all of his heart and with all of his soul and with all of his strength in accordance to the laws of Moses. Pretty good. It's a solid epitaph. Now, probably written by scribes in Josiah's court, right? This is the kind of thing you would write if you were writing the story for yourself. But also, it's a direct quote from Deuteronomy. The passage from Deuteronomy, the great law is called the Shema, which in Hebrew is hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your mind, and with all of your strength, and with all of your soul, right? That's the great commandment. And that's what it says that Josiah does. No one has followed the Shema like Josiah. And in part, and there's other evidence where there's some thought that Josiah is either bringing what he discovered, the book of the law, is the book of Deuteronomy. Whether it's some portion of Deuteronomy, whether it's him taking the book of Deuteronomy and re-editing it and redacting it and putting it into kind of a more final form that we have today. But there's this correlation to the things that Josiah is doing, that Josiah is getting rid of the altars, he's getting rid of the idols, destroying the high places, the things that Deuteronomy is telling them to do, celebrating the Passover, right? And the things that Josiah in his reign has done. And then, of course, it directly quotes Deuteronomy, saying Josiah is this one who has followed the Lord. So Josiah is like legit. And God has mercy and pity on Josiah and said, you will go and live with your ancestors. You will go and die, and you will not see the destruction of Israel. But the wrath is coming. But that doesn't mean God has forgotten. So while Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. There are three big players in the world today. There's later going to be a fourth, and then a fifth, and then a sixth, but there's three players. Who are the global players in the world around King Josiah? Who are the three big empires? Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Egypt is kind of this kingdom, obviously, in northern Africa, but separated. There's physical distance. Assyria and Babylon are pushed up against each other. They're kissing cousins. They're always kind of going back and forth. It's kind of like North and South Dakota, right? They're all, I don't know if North and South Dakota are always vying for power, but like to us, the kind of the Dakotas, you know, it could just be one. Assyria and Babylon are like this. But Assyria, that's taken and destroyed the northern kingdom, Assyria has come down and taken all of Samaria and enslaved all the people, all the 10 northern tribes. Assyria, that king, Tiglath-Pileser III, who we're talking about for the last several weeks, they are now waning. Tiglath-Pileser, and then there's a guy, Sennacherib, who comes after him. He's murdered by his sons. There's a coup, and the coup is forming. And now Assyria is waning. But they're all interchangeable, right? Assyrians and Babylonians. So Assyrians hate the Babylonians. Babylonians hate the Assyrians. They all speak the same language. They write the same language. They all write in Akkadian. The Assyrians are trying to make alliance with the Egyptians, and they're trying to sort it out. And Jerusalem is stuck in the middle. They saw what the Assyrians did, but they're trying to figure out, who do we woo? Do we go with the Egyptians? Do we go with the Babylonians? Right? Because who's not going to destroy us? They decide to start by siding with the Babylonians, putting them at war with the Egyptians. So that's why King Josiah is going to be killed, it says, by the Pharaoh Necho. After this, well, where he won. So you see the Egyptians. Man, I love a good map. I love a good map. So you see the Egyptians coming through Jerusalem, and they fight right here in Megiddo, north of Jerusalem. Megiddo, what is significant about Megiddo? It's the last battle. It's Armageddon, right? It's called Armageddon. Megiddo is a great plain. It's the best place. If you have two armies coming to converge on each other, this is where you're going to do it. You're not going to go with your army and fight at the Dead Sea, because you'd have to walk for days through the desert and there's no water and no access to anything. And you're like maybe going to die just on the journey there. You're not going to fight in Jerusalem, because that's the hill country. Because if you fight in the hill country, somebody's going to be uphill. You're going to meet at a place that's convenient for both armies to arrive. So they can go through the valleys, Egypt coming up to the north. You have the Assyrians and Babylonians coming down, and they can meet in this big wide open space, perfect for these big armies with chariots and horses and kind of old school technology. So they meet in Megiddo. You know, there's something called the Tell of Megiddo, the little hill of Megiddo, where they've uncovered 19 generations, at least 19 different layers of history, of generations of war, right? Where they think it's been 1,000 years of people fighting in this battlefield, this battle area, of just dying and laying waste to humanity. This is where all the great armies are going to be going through and fighting through. And on the very edge of Megiddo is Nazareth, where Jesus is born. Where Nazareth, where he's raised, right? And it's where Mary, his mother, is from. And so, you know, I think of this, I see this image of Jesus looking out over this valley that's like physically drenched in the blood of generations of humanity. And the idea of in Revelation is the last battle will be fought in this area of Armageddon, which is later translated into in Greek. The last battle will be here, because this is where all the battles were. This is the battle site. So Josiah goes out to confront the Egyptians, to try to make this alliance with the Babylonians. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of thing, where I don't like the Babylonians, but maybe if I make that, maybe they can help me defeat the Assyrians, because it was under his great-grandfather Hezekiah where the Assyrians had laid siege to Jerusalem. You follow me? So King Josiah is killed. It's very sad for King Josiah. The Egyptians continue to go north, go through Kadesh, through Aleppo, and they fight at Charmesh, the great battle of Charmesh, which is really close to Haran. Y'all remember what happens at Haran? Kind of. He's from Ur. He stops in Haran on his way, but it's his son Isaac, who's going to go to Haran to look for a wife, Rebecca. So he sends his people to Haran, which is way the hell far away. I mean, this is like a terribly long journey. But the army goes up to Charmesh and they have the last battle, and the Babylonians win and defeat the Egyptians. And this is kind of putting one of the nails in the Assyrian Empire's coffin. After this, the Egyptian Empire is kind of done. There were 3 generations of Egyptian empires. The second one, I believe, is when they built the huge pyramids of Giza, the ones that we'd see. But this is ancient history, even in the time of King Josiah. The pyramids are ancient to Josiah. After this, the Egyptian Empire is never going to take world dominance again. And then the Assyrians are going to be defeated by Babylonians, and they will never be in the world again. Now is the rise of the Babylonians. The Babylonians, and then it's going to be the Persians, and after the Persians, it's going to be kind of the Hellenized world. Alexander the Great is going to come in and start making kind of the Greek Empire that will later be replaced by the Romans, taking us kind of into modern day. Tracking. Josiah has 3 sons. 1, 2, 3, they're in descending order, and they're going to be up for king, then knocked down again, and finally Israel will be wiped out by the exile. So first is Jahaz, which means Yahweh has held, which is what a terrible and unfortunate name for this guy. Yahweh has held. Because he's 23 years old, he becomes king and he reigns for 3 months. Like, well, Yahweh hasn't held very long, has he? Pharaoh Necho put him in chains in the land of Hamath so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. So Pharaoh Necho kills Josiah, takes his son. They haven't yet fought the battle with the Babylonians, so Egyptians are still around. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim means resurrection of the Lord. Pretty powerful. Jehoiakim pays Pharaoh Necho the silver and gold he demands, and in order to do so, he taxed the land, exacted the silver and gold from the people of the land according to their assessments. You know, and when a tax gets recorded by the Old Testament, that also must have been profound. The fact that it mentions they had to levy a tax must have been so hard on the people that it's recorded as scripture. That becomes not just a burden, but people are outraged, people are infuriated, people are like destroyed by this tax. Remember what we talked about 2 weeks ago? I think there's like a 3-prong phase. There's a 3-prong phase. You make a vassal, and then a puppet, and then you utterly destroy. So his first son, he made him a vassal. He said, you know what, do this on my behalf. Didn't work out. Only 3 months later, so he arrests him, takes that first guy, Jehoahaz, takes him to Egypt as a prisoner. So then I'm going to install my puppet. So I'm going to bring in Eliakim. And Eliakim is just going to do whatever the heck I say. Eliakim pays him all the gold, levies this huge tax. And then it's going to come the exile. And if you recall, that's also the same pattern that we're going to have in the time of Jesus. That you have Herod as the vassal servant. Then you're going to have Pilate as a puppet. And then finally, they're going to destroy Jerusalem. But then here comes Nebuchadnezzar. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invades the land. Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years, then turned against Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar is a really wild name because it means Nebu, oh Nebu, protect my son. Nebu being a Babylonian god. And so in this funny way that you have all these names like Josiah, means the bulwark of God, you have these other names of surrounding kings like Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, pious prince. These are the names of Nebuchadnezzar. Man, and I love it. This is how I want to be introduced. Instead of God saying to me on Judgment Day, gird up your loins, pull up your big girl panties and answer some questions, I want him to call me by this. King of Babylon, pious prince, favorite of the god Marduk, exalted ruler who is the beloved of the god Nebu, the one who deliberates and acquires wisdom, the one who constantly seeks out the way of their divinity and reveres their dominion, the indefatigable, how do you pronounce that word? Sarah, what's that word? Indefatigable governor who is mindful of provisioning Eshcol and Isdab daily, and who constantly seeks out good things for Babylon and Borsippa, the wise, pious one who provides for Esagil and Azida, foremost heir of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and am I. Whew, he's like 6 gods named in that. And man, he's all over the place.
It's not humble.
That's how he introduces himself. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be a big deal. He's going to change the world and bring the Babylonian Empire into reality. The Babylonian Empire that's going to stretch all over through Babylon, through what would be Iraq, through Iran, the tip of Saudi Arabia, all the way down through Turkey, through Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, into Egypt. He's going to conquer the world. He's going to build. But the thing is, he's not really regarded in world history as a warrior prince. It's not that he has military might so much as that he's a builder. And in part, this is what Herod is trying to do as well. In part, Herod is a builder, right? You can make your mark in the world history in a lot of different ways. But if you build a Colosseum that can stand for 3,000 years, 2,000 years, right? That is something that people can see and know. That's why I built the addition on St. Thomas. For all future generations, right? No, but like he rebuilds this entrance, this gate. He rebuilds the hanging gardens of Babylon. I was talking to my next door neighbor who had gone and served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he's saying, yeah, like I went to Saddam Hussein's palace. It's built on top of the ruins of ancient Babylon, and it's excavated, and you have like all these, it's like this historical site, because this is what Nebuchadnezzar built, his legacy to the world. He built ziggurats, these huge, massive temples. They're going to celebrate God, his many gods. Nebuchadnezzar, but militarily, he's going to take over the world. It's going to be great. You can see it stretch all the way from way down here, where Abraham's from, all the way to the Mediterranean Ocean and down through Gaza, down to the very tip of Egypt. He's not going to take over all of Egypt, but it seems like good enough. It's not just that the Assyrians conquer it and the Babylonians, then the Persians and the Greeks. They kind of take it over one from the other, and expanding. So by the time, Alexander the Great comes, and Alexander the Great, no doubt, was phenomenal. How old is he when he dies? Like 30, early 30s. In part, he's just taking over the Persian Empire, and he's making deals with these local chieftains to say, okay, you were Persian, now you're Greek. You were paying homage to this guy, now you're paying homage to me. So he's going and conquering some with might, some he's paying off, and some they're paying him for protection. So the world is going to get bigger and bigger. So by the time Rome comes, right? Yeah, they're going to fight some, but mostly they're going to make those same alliances. They're going to develop infrastructure. They're going to build roads and aqueducts and waterways. They're going to provide things that people need. And all it requires is a heavy tax and your children to sacrifice in our wars. What's the big deal? But in a way, they're building. So Babylon is larger than Assyria. The empire of Babylon is significantly larger. And you see in this the ancient groups that are being taken over through this. Obviously, this is Mesopotamia. You're seeing the Elamites, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, not Samaritans, the Canaanites, the Ugarites. The Ugarites are really important because a lot of our oldest writings are in Ugaritic. So like the Epic of Gilgamesh is written in Ugaritic, the language just around Syria, Lebanon, north of Israel. The Hittites, the Midianites, these are the people who are the ancient foes of Israel, and they're now all consolidated. And then, of course, today, where we're looking, this big area, we're looking from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, right? So it looks like they're going all the way through what today would be Israel, Syria, Iraq, all the way through Iraq to the very border of Iran. Iran isn't going to be taken over by Babylon because Persia is going to rise up in that place. The Lord sent Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, Ammonite raiders against him to destroy Judah in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants. Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of these former kings of Israel, including shedding of innocent blood. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. It's not just that like Nebuchadnezzar was smart or stronger or better. It's that God is empowering them to destroy Israel. That Israel has so sinned against God. At least I think Nebuchadnezzar might have a different perspective, but the theological perspective of the Old Testament is, why has this happened? And the answer is, because you have not been faithful to God. The very end of Deuteronomy, again, maybe why we think it was King Josiah in his court that this was kind of released. It says, I've set before you a way of life and a way of death. Follow my commandments, worship me, reject idolatry and idols, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and you will live. Or choose death. Don't follow me, don't listen to me. Choose your own life and your own pride and your egos, marry foreign women, have idolatry, and you will surely die. You will be rejected by the land itself. And that's what happens. The Israelites have chosen the idolatry, and it's kind of God saying, this is kind of the end of the circle. That this is the punishment of your bad decisions. I try to quote that to my children all the time, right? When they're like fighting with me to like put on pants or, their socks and shoes. It's like, I set before you a way of life and death. Put on your socks, or you surely will be banished from this house for all of your days. But it's not seen as just, oh, Babylon got bigger. No, no one is bigger than God. God is one. God is God of the universe. They are only empowered because of God to come in and wipe out Israel. But that doesn't mean God is dead. It doesn't mean God is gone. And it doesn't mean that God has forsaken the land, that God will still be there in the land. If you recall, after the Assyrians took over North Israel, the Assyrians are there and they're resettling the land and they're being attacked by mountain lions. And so, oh no, it must be because we're not worshiping the God of this land properly. So they cry out to God. They get a local prophet to come and he tells them like, don't worship idols, but they do it anyway. But I say, God is still there. God is infused in the very soil of the land. And in some ways, this is the argument for people who believe in the Israeli state. This is in the 1940s and 1950s, and as they're having the wars in the 1960s, this was part of the justification. God is literally in the soil of Israel. That God is here, like physically manifest in this place on this land. And they say, we're so sorry, Palestinians, that you were here first. We're so sorry that you came and that you've been farming it for 2,000 years. We're so sorry that you thought you could have this land, but this is God's land. And we genetically are God's people. And so now it's our land. And I don't want to wade into the Palestinian conflict. Although to say, we had this really interesting conversation in Jerusalem with a Palestinian scholar and with an Israeli scholar, and they're arguing back and forth about whose land it is. And they're making kind of all the points that one can make. But finally, the Israeli said, look, in the history of the world, people have always fought over land. People have always fought over land. And what happens is there'll be a war, and the winners will get the land. And that's what happened. He said, we were the winners, and yet now the global community is trying to tell us that we can't have the land. He said, we won the war, we should have the land. I don't know. But the idea, this is all integrated into the deepest sense of what it means to be an Israelite, deepest sense of what it means to be God, that God is this person who gives land. That's how you know God loves you. He gives you land. And implied in that land, that is wealth. That land is inheritance for future generations. Heaven on earth is this land. There are also, of course, a lot of very interesting Christians who want to exacerbate war, final war, the war to end all wars. They want to exacerbate it and begin in Israel because they believe that will precipitate the coming of the kingdom. That will precipitate final judgment. It'll precipitate them being assumed into heaven. Well, it'd be good for them, I guess. But there are people, very unique set of Christians, like Mike Pompeo, who are looking to the advent of the last nuclear war to destroy the planet, because that would be the coming of God. Yikes. So then finally, Jehoiakim rested with his ancestors, and his son Jehoiachin succeeds him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again because he'd just been defeated. This is Babylon comes and defeats Egypt and the Pharaoh at the Battle of Chermesh, and says the king of Egypt does not march out of his country again, because the king of Babylon had taken all of his territory from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he becomes king, and he reigns in Jerusalem for 3 months. This is it. This is the end. This is the exile. In the 8th year of the reign, the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner. As the Lord had declared, because this is divine providence, Nebuchadnezzar removes all the treasures from the temple. He cut up the golden articles that Solomon, the king of Israel, had made. He carried all of Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and all the prominent people. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans. And he made Jehoiachin's uncle king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. You don't need to take everyone. You don't need to take the burdens to society back with you. You just take like the handsome, the strong, the good looking, the productive. Like obviously we would have been taken in exile. We would have been the ones taken with him. You feel like, you imagine some people are sitting in their hovels afterwards, like, I'm glad that we still are here, but kind of makes you feel bad about yourself, doesn't it? You're the one left. Like, really, Babylon? We have no utility for you. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works around it. Zedekiah, who is supposed to be a puppet king, is starting to rebel. Nebuchadnezzar says, like, not today. You know what? Not this year. I've had enough. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe there was no food for the people to eat. And the city wall was broken through. And the whole army fled at night through the city gate. And they fled, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him, and all the soldiers were separated from him and scattered. He was captured. It is the end. Let's see. The commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, he comes in and he sets fire to the temple, the royal place, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building is burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander broke down the walls around Jerusalem. The commander of the guard carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. It is now ruined. When one of the harshest things that Goliath is shouting at the Israelite army is he's like coming out every day. Goliath is huge, massive, and he's coming out and screaming like, come out, send out your best warrior. I will destroy him, and I'll destroy you, and I'll destroy your brothers and your mothers and everything that you've ever known and everything that you've ever loved. I'll destroy it all. He's like, you are nothing, and your God cannot protect you. And maybe your God has abandoned you. Your God has forgotten you. This is the greatest insult of all. This is the insult that compels David. David comes out and he says, who's this asshole to like taunt our God? Who's this guy to say that like our God is not the God of the universe? And so David walks out, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, right? It's an amazing moment in world movie history. David, because God is real, because God is alive, because God isn't just in some ethereal place. He's right there in the tabernacle. He's with our army. He's marching beside us. Solomon builds a temple as this reminder that God is here, that this is how we are Israelite people, people of God, because of the kingdom, because of the temple, that even in our hardship, even in famine, even in war, even in death, we know that God is here. We just simply turn to the temple. And now the temple is destroyed. This is in part why it's going to be so amazing when King Herod rebuilds the temple in the lifetime, the beginning of the lifetime of Jesus. He's rebuilding the Temple Mount. He's saying God is coming back to Israel. The God will have been gone. The temple will have been destroyed. And this is going to have all the ramifications. This is going to fundamentally change Judaism. This moment, not Jesus and not the destruction of the second temple, This is going to change what it means to be Jewish. To be Jewish before the exile is to be worshiping at the temple. That God was in the Passover, then God was in the tabernacle, now God's in the temple. This is where God is, even when people are being bad. And now it's all gone. So by the time Herod's rebuilding it, you have all these new people. You have the Sadducees who are saying, no, God's definitely in the temple again. Sadducees control the temple, and they also control the monies that come into the temple. There's a lot of money to be had at the temple because you're making sacrifice, and you're paying for sacrifice and exchanging monies, and it's big business, and it's power and it's authority. You're the most important person in the world. If everyone has to come and worship in your temple and you control the temple, that is privilege. That is power. That's like profound. So, but you also have the Pharisees. The Pharisees are just out and about worshiping all over the place. The random rabbis throughout the woods, because there's for 500 years there's no centralized temple any longer. So Judaism itself had to evolve. And then you have some other people, the Essenes, you have the Zealots, you have some weirdos in the streets claiming to be Messiah. But this is the moment, Ashley, where it's all gone. The exile, gone forever. Some historians suggest, we know, like here in Alabama, we look over to Georgia, we understand the scorched earth policy. We understand, like, historically why you would do that. You do that in part to, like, as an example for all future parties that want to rise up against you. You kind of burn everything because you're angry at the wars you had to fight to get to this point. You do it just to be mean and ugly, as punishment for the people who rebelled against you. Some historians suggest that the burning and destroying of Jerusalem may have been a scorched earth policy against Egypt, because Jerusalem isn't really significant to Babylon. It's one of the most important things that Nebuchadnezzar does, is take over Jerusalem, but it's not strategically that important. They could have just shut Israel off, but I think they're making an example to Egypt because Egypt was rebelling against Babylon, and say, if you come at us, we will destroy you and everything you've ever loved. We're leaving this as a poster, as a billboard to all future nations that will ever rise up against Babylon, that we will tear apart everything you love, brick from brick, that you don't matter, your gods don't exist. This is also, theologically, the great crisis for the Israelites. That what if God doesn't exist? The temple is gone. There is no ark. There is no Spirit of God. What if God has truly abandoned us? Great segue to the uplifting prophets like Jeremiah. Like, God has left us. We will all surely die. The Babylonians broke up everything. They broke up the bronze pillars. They took away the pots and shovels and wick trimmers. They took even the wick trimmers, the little tiny golden, scissors, decorative scissors. They took even the wick trimmers. And the fact is, recorded in the Bible is just fantastic. Took everything. The commander of the guard took his prisoners, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the priest next in line, and the 3 doorkeepers. So even the priests are taken. And the king had them executed. God is dead. Well, good luck, everybody. See you later. Can you name some people who are taken in exile? Can you think of anybody? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah. Jeremiah. Think of all the later prophets, right? There's 3 periods of prophecy. There's people who are prophesying that the end is coming, people prophesying like Jeremiah that the end is here, and people prophesying that, like, there's a way out of exile at the end. But this is the end of the book of Kings.
King Z and company have some special treatment. Didn't King Z and his sons have some special treatment in the end?
Rick, say that one more time, a little bit louder.
King Z, whatever, and his sons wasn't the king blinded and not before his sons were all executed? Or am I thinking of another one?
Man, I'm having a hard time hearing you, Rick.
Let's see. I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but speak with gusto.
King Z
Yes.
and his sons, didn't they have a special disposition? At the end, all of his sons were killed in front of his eyes, and then he was blinded.
King Z,
Or king, or what, the last.
the last king
Uh,
of Israel.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think Second Kings ends here.
He did.
Yeah,
They,
they blinded him.
well, they killed his sons and then they got his eyes out.
Yeah, it was really terrible.
all right. Big finish.
Yeah, it was profound. Tell me, I'll let y'all go here in a second, but questions or thoughts or insights you've had about kings or the kings of Jerusalem and Judah and Israel, thoughts you've had about the book of First and Second Kings.
I have a thought.
Yeah, Sarah said there's something she noticed.
It seemed like the kings of Israel were all bad, but the kings of Judah, some of them were okay and some of them were not.
There were a few kings in Kingdom of Israel that weren't terrible, but mostly they were bad.
Yeah, that was just what I noticed in my 1-year plan. And I just got it canceled.
Sure. If y'all remember, Samuel was distraught when they asked for a king. Samuel begged them to not ask for a king because he said, what's going to happen if you get a king is they're going to take your sons for war fodder. They're going to take your daughters as like servants, slaves, and as like concubines. They're going to tax you and they're going to take everything you've loved. You're giving away the blessings of God. You're giving away your children. You're giving away your wealth, and you're going to give away your inheritance of land. And remember, those are the ways that God's blessing flows. It says you do this, you're giving away your children, your wealth, and your land. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. And we see all of that and more. What does it cost Israel? Ultimately, it's going to cost them everything. Because these people who are rising up as kings are the ones who are leading them to idolatry, are the ones who are leading them to forsake God, as like the chief theocratic governor of the land. So then we go into books of wisdom. We're going to have books like Esther and Daniel, which is considered a book of wisdom, Job. And then we're going to get to the prophets, and the prophets are going to be talking about pre-exile, during exile, and some post-exile. And then we have a couple books talking about what happens after the return. But really then it's just kind of a fading to gray until the story continues with King Herod. And that's that gray period. There's like the Maccabean Wars, there's the Maccabean revolts, there's world history, but we don't have deep scripture at that time, right? There's kind of this pausing until King Herod comes and the story really begins again. But the story
Be
is
Bible.
in this story. And Jesus comes. All right. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Tom.
Maybe it's not fair, but I'm going to ask you if you had to sum up what the lessons are or what we're supposed to take from the book of Kings in 2 sentences, what would it be?
If I had to sum up, I don't know, that's a good question. What do y'all think? If you had to sum up the lessons, what are the theological lessons of the book of First and Second Kings? First and Second Samuel. What's the theology that we're supposed to understand? I'd say one, that there is a God. That there is a God of the universe. God, all that is, a God of great glory, who's also a very intimate God. A God who's concerned with what's happening in daily life. A God who's responsive to our pain and our suffering. And a God who interacts with us directly. A God that when we do wrong and we fall out of God's purview are also welcomed back in. That it's a God of unbelievable grace. Again and again, God is saying, come back to me, come back to me.
But he's got a terrible temper. He says, you did this, I'm going to destroy you. You did this, I'm going to destroy you again.
In a sense, that's, Sarah, we teach these stories, and I always want to say, never in my presence talk about the Old Testament God as one of wrath and anger. It's not that exactly. It's God saying, I'm giving you the opportunity to choose something wonderful, and you have chosen to step out of that room. I'm offering you this beautiful gift, and you are choosing not to accept it.
Well, see, what
And
I
so
do-
it's not a God of anger and wrath, where God is giving provisions, especially in the
Or
book of
else.
Deuteronomy. God is giving you these provisions. Like, how do you live as a society? What if somebody murders somebody? What if somebody breaks the law? How do you welcome that person back in? How do you welcome in refugees? How do you welcome in people who've done terrible things? How do you extend grace to the foreigner and to the exile? How can you be part of this abundance of God's love? But you can choose to separate yourself from God by your own actions and your own choices. And God hates it. And God would go to every distance and length to redeem you. But like, you can isolate yourself. I mean, the way that Jesus says, look, not everyone who cries out, my Lord, my God, my Lord, and say, I do not know you. I do not know you. And they'll say, well, when did you not know us? He said, when I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was sick, when I was thirsty, you did not give me something to drink. When I was naked, you did not give me something. So there will be a winning time where I separate the sheep from the goats. And it's not maybe in the way that evangelicals or Pentecostals or the Baptists are teaching this, but saying you can separate yourself from God. You can separate yourself from God, but it's by your choice. It's by your life. And ultimately, Jesus gives this example of the rich man, right? And there's a poor beggar, Lazarus, who's outside his gate every day begging. And every day the rich man ignores him. And every day he drives past him, oblivious to the pain and suffering of this man. And says, after this great judgment day, they both die. And Lazarus is in the presence of God. And this rich man is like in eternal suffering in Gehenna. And he's crying out to Lazarus, or he's crying out to his brothers, like, send somebody out to warn my brothers, go and tell them like of the pain and suffering. He says, no, you had your life and you chose to separate yourself from the goodness of God. And it's not God's wrath. It's not God's righteous vengeance and violence that you've chosen to separate yourself from God. In the way I would say, I would say to my daughters, I'd implore them. I'm like, fighting with them to put their shoes on. It's like, please, dear God, put on your shoes. And they're like, well, we just want to go out and play. And I'm like doing everything. I'm throwing a fit. I'm like, I'm going to ground you. I'm going to punish you if you don't put on your shoes. And they're just like, no. And they run outside and they step in a fire ant bed. And then they're screaming and crying. I'm like, Dad, you're so evil and ugly. Like, I'm in great pain and suffering. And
Well, that's what I think happens with the Bible, is that maybe what happens to these people is they make a bad political choice and they have logical consequences of what they do. That it's not necessarily God throwing a thunderbolt.
yeah.
It's that they made the wrong line. And then we blame it on God.
But then, if we want to understand fully the Old Testament God, if we want to understand like this God who's trying to make himself known and real, then we have to understand this person of Jesus who comes to say, I am the fulfillment of this Old Testament God. And so we turn to this person, Jesus, to say, what is Jesus telling us and showing us about all this God of Israel? And Jesus who's coming to us and saying, I'm giving you this new way to live. I'm giving you the way of life. Choose it and follow me. In your life, your resurrection begins now. It's an abundant life that starts today. And so Jesus is. So what are the lessons of the Old Testament God? The lesson is summarized in this person, Jesus, right? This responsive God who's attuned to our own self. And yeah, you say, you talk about evil, you talk about suffering in the world, and some of it we can mitigate. Like you say, well, why is there hurricanes? It's like, well, why do we build houses in Louisiana? It's like underwater. Like, why are there hurricanes that destroy our homes? Like, yeah, well, why do we build on the coast? Or why do we like pour fossil fuel into the atmosphere and then destroy the planet? Like, is that God? Is that on us?
That's God.
I think people say, well, where's God in cancer? Why would God allow cancer to exist? You say, I don't know. Why would God empower scientists and doctors to learn how to mitigate cancer and how to create, anti-coronavirus vaccine in this rapid, amazing time? It's like, yeah, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Where is God? It's like, well, God is in this person, Jesus. Jesus would come to show us God's love, to show it through service, through humility, through sacrifice, through forgiveness, and give us the opportunity to follow that. All right, that's the end. Everyone's in exile. God is dead. Y'all have a great morning. We'll see you
Recording
all
off.
upstairs. Bye, everybody.
Have a good one.